The question that we are answering here is, did Adam and Eve exist? And the scientific evidence might just blow your mind. This is a presentation by myself, Donny Budinsky, and Matt Nailor. We run the Standing for Truth Ministries. This right here is our website, standingfortruthministries.com. And we've put a lot of work into giving everybody endless content on all things creation, evolution, and origins. And so you can check out the website and you'll find answers to various challenges to the biblical creation model. We've also published several books on the topic of origins. Here are a couple relevant books to what we are going to be discussing tonight on Adam and Eve. This book here is Special Creation, Dismantling Evolution and Confirming Independent Origins. In this book, you'll find comprehensive answers to questions regarding mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Noah, which model is better supported by the scientific evidence out of Africa or the out of Middle East model. We get into the hominin fossil record discussing Neanderthals. We're going to discuss a lot of that evidence here in this presentation. I've also written a book, The Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, Dismantling the Best Evidence for Common Descent. Some people in the audience might be wondering, what are endogenous retroviruses? If you were to look up on YouTube or Google, what is the so-called best evidence for evolution or common descent? What you'll typically find nowadays is endogenous retroviruses. They are, as the argument goes, they will assert that we as humans share viral DNA with chimpanzees. And they say this type of DNA is the ancient leftover remnants of viral invasions in the past. And we must have inherited those viral infections from a common ancestor with chimpanzees. And I thoroughly dismantle that argument. The question actually is regarding ERVs, are these really the ancient leftover remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? And incredibly, we've discovered many important functional roles for this so-called viral DNA. They act in embryological development. They act in our immune system. They determine cell types. And so the best explanation for ERVs is common design and not common descent. We've also published several technical articles. This is one here that I recommend people check out if they want to dig deep on this issue. This article here I co-authored with a friend, Christopher Roop. It was peer-reviewed by Dr. John Sanford, author of Genetic Entropy. And this article expands on the genetic entropy thesis, which is the idea that mutations are accumulating unchecked. The majority of them are deleterious, and natural selection can't see them. They're invisible. And so populations descend into genetic sickness and genetic degeneration. There's no forward fish to fisherman evolution. What we see is devolution. Critics have come forth and they've attempted to address genetic entropy. And this article is a deep dive into some of those arguments as we refute them. Another couple articles that you might enjoy has to do with another common argument put forth by apologists of common descent. This is the so-called human chromosome 2 fusion argument. And they'll say that our chromosome 2 is the result of an ancient fusion. And they look to very specific telomeric signatures to establish that argument. A friend and I went in, made a prediction, and we discovered through our research project, we discovered similar signatures elsewhere in the genome, suggesting that the chromosome 2 is not a fusion after all. I've got a whole presentation on that, but those are just some recommended resources for people. to check out. This is a short film that we put out, The Amazing Science of Adam and Eve. And so for those looking for a short, this is about 12 minutes or so. Matt, my ministry partner here, he fully edited it. He used some really cool AI, and it's visually stunning. It goes through the amazing science of Adam and Eve, which we're going to cover here in this presentation, but this gives a lot of that same information, but in a visually appealing way. And okay, I want to go over a brief overview of what we are going to be discussing here tonight. We are going to discuss several important and very thought-provoking topics. These topics include the Y chromosome. This is the piece of DNA that makes a man a man. Men carry this piece of DNA and women do not. We will be showing you how science has confirmed the Bible. Science has discovered the first man, and that first man lines up perfectly with biblical origins. All men in the world have inherited Adam's Y chromosome. We've discovered Adam and Eve in our genetics. This is also why we will be discussing the other important piece of DNA that can be traced back to the mother of us all, Eve. That DNA would be the mitochondrial DNA. Tonight's talk will be a mix of technical arguments and not so technical arguments, as we do want to be comprehensive. We want to give you the best scientific evidence for Adam and Eve available, but we also want to give everybody something to take home and utilize in conversations with fellow believers and skeptics. And some of this information might just blow your mind, especially if you're a skeptic. Now, here's a couple quotes, one biblical passage and one motto that we can all live by. 1 Corinthians 2:5, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. We need to believe God more and believe man less. Man is fallible. A good motto, and we will discover this here in this talk tonight. Good science always upholds God's word. Now, here are several quotes from anti-young earth creationists, prominent anti-young earth creationists, showing why this topic here tonight on the science of Adam and Eve is so important. This is Dr. Francis Collins, well-known advocate of theistic evolution. He said this at a conference in 2011. There is no way you can develop this level of variation between us from one or two ancestors. So what he's saying is basically all the diversity today in human beings, there's no way that that could have been derived from just two people a few thousand years ago. Firstly, this argument assumes that all DNA variation is due to mutations. And I'll expand on that in a little bit, as I want to go over another quote from another popular or prominent theistic evolutionist, anti-creationist. This is Dr. Dennis Venema. He said, you would have to postulate that there's been this absolutely astronomical mutation rate that has produced all these new variants in an incredibly short period of time. Those types of mutation rates are just not possible. It would mutate us out of existence. Dennis would be right if, again, all DNA diversity was the result of mutations over time. So I think we're seeing a trend here, a common straw man argument from these prominent anti-biblical creationists. They are assuming that all DNA variation is the result of mutations over time. There are two very distinct explanations or models in the creation and evolution viewpoints on the origin of genetic diversity. Evolutionists, they're the ones that believe all or nearly all DNA diversity is a result of deleterious mutation accumulation over time. That's what adds, according to them, the novel genetic variation that selection can act upon to drive evolutionary change. We as creationists, we would argue, or at least the model that Matt and I put forth, we would argue that the majority of DNA diversity is the result of design diversity, that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve with high levels of what's called heterozygosity at creation, pre-existing DNA differences, which can explain all the variation that we see today. This also makes sense theologically, because when God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, did he want that to be carried out through cloning? The answer is obviously no. God loves diversity and variation. And so it makes sense both theologically and scientifically that God would have created the original created kinds with pre-existing diversity. In other words, in a state of DNA diversity. And this model makes very specific predictions. The critics might scoff, but they would have to deal with the scientific predictions that are derived from this hypothesis. And so the design diversity model would suggest that the vast majority of the genome is functional rather than junk. Proponents of evolution and evolutionary scientists, many of them still hold on to this overturned idea that the majority of our genome is junk and representative of evolutionary leftovers or genetic mistakes over time. We've actually discovered through various research projects, here's one right here, and this is fascinating. They've discovered that at least 80% of the genome has activity. And this activity is not, as the evolutionists say, noise or spurious. Non-functional activity is what some of them will try and say. And the reason why is because if the vast majority of this activity were junk or useless, there should be mechanisms over time that would have weeded out these systems of all of this genetic baggage. For example, transcription, we understand you got DNA transcribed into RNA, translated into a protein. Transcription is an energy-intensive and resource-intensive process. Every time you add a single nucleotide to a growing RNA chain, you're consuming energy. This would be wasteful of energy and resources for the cell if it were not functional. We also have, and we've documented in our books and presentations, paper after paper showing important and essential functional roles for just about every single DNA unit that the evolutionists would say is junk. For example, here are a number of papers documenting known functional roles for so-called pseudogenes. We have documented numerous functions for endogenous retroviruses. They're playing an antiviral role in the genome. They work to determine cell types. They regulate gene expression, help turn genes on and off, and essential in regulating early stages of human embryonic development. Here's a slide with another several papers going over the essential roles of ERVs. And so design diversity makes very specific predictions, and those predictions are proving to be true. It's a great time to be a biblical creationist. Here's a famous atheist, Dr. Richard Dawkins. Just about everybody knows who Richard Dawkins is. He is a militant atheist. And he said, no educated person believes the Adam and Eve myth nowadays, but it's surprising how many parents think that it's somehow fun to pass on this falsehood to their children. I would want to argue that the truth of evolution is more interesting and more poetic. This is another famous skeptic, Frank R. Zindler. He made this argument in a debate with prominent Christian theologian William Lane Craig. He said, the most devastating thing that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. These are his assertions. They're not necessarily true, of course, but these are his assertions. Now that we know that Adam and Eve never were real people, according to him, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, there is no need of salvation. If there is no need of salvation, there is no need of a savior. And I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. These atheists have understood this anti-Christian formula for a long time. If there was no Adam, there is no need for the last Adam. The existence of a historical Adam and Eve is essential theologically. We know that sin exists And we know the reason death has come into this world. The reason why is because of sin. We are dead in Adam, but we can be alive in the last Adam, who is Jesus Christ. Salvation comes through Jesus Christ, God manifest in the flesh. And the necessity of salvation comes because of what Adam and Eve, our first parents, did. We are suffering the effects of the fall. Those effects are death, degeneration, pain, suffering, and extinction. Death did not exist prior to sin and prior to the fall. If we get rid of the historical Adam, we generate major theological difficulties, and these atheists understand this. That's why the theistic evolutionists, their position is exactly the position that the atheists want to hear, because it's easily refuted and contradicted. There is, as we're going to show here tonight, absolutely no need to compromise the Bible. The Bible is true. God's word can be trusted. We will see throughout this presentation that science has confirmed the Bible's account of origins. The Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. If this is true, we should be able to compare real scientific evidence to the Bible's claims on origins and get confirmation. And that is exactly what we are going to do here tonight. Now, we will be focusing heavily on genetics and how the human genome confirms biblical history, and go over the biblical model of human origins, showing exactly why it is a superior model to the evolutionary model of origins. Several lines of evidence we will be discussing: low genetic diversity, mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Noah, mutation rates, genetic degeneration. We just went over the DNA function. Firstly, what does the Bible say? As you're going to see, the Bible is extremely clear about the origin of man. The book of Genesis makes several genetic statements with significant implications. Genesis 2:7. Here's a very important genetic statement. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. Genesis 2:21 to 22. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman. There's Adam, there's Eve. Clearly no common ancestry with apes or any other form of life there in those passages. Again, if there was no first Adam, then what is the necessity of the last Adam? If Adam did not really exist, then why did Jesus die for the sins of the world? Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, confirms the existence of Adam and Eve. Jesus says in Matthew 19:4, and he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning, referring back to the creation week, made them male and female, referring to Adam and Eve? Mark 10:6, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. 1 Corinthians 15:45, Adam, the first man. Genesis 3:20, Eve was the mother of all living. The Bible claims there's no common ancestry between humans and any other form of life. Now, before covering some of these lines of evidence, I do want to give an overview of the evolutionary and biblical creation models in order that we're all on the same page. And so this here is a sophisticated phylogenetic tree of life. The evolutionary model says that all life, including plants and animals, that means you as a human, and a banana plant, are related through common ancestry, according to their position. As you can see here, here's another evolutionary tree. You've got mushrooms, fish, bacteria, whales, and chimpanzees, all related through common ancestry, and according to their position, can be traced back to a single common ancestor billions of years ago. The creation or separate ancestry model is a very different model. It would suggest that humans, as we've read in the previous passages in Genesis and also from Jesus Christ himself, humans are created special and independent from any other form of life, including chimpanzees and banana plants. You'll oftentimes hear when you're debating an evolutionist, they'll say, you don't believe in evolution? The question that needs to be asked is, what do you mean by evolution? Because if by evolution you mean change over time, or that domestic dogs, wolves, and coyotes are related, then we're not going to have an issue because things change over time. My thinking process changes over time. Our phones change over time. Cars change over time. Animals were designed to adapt and to change. But if by evolution you mean dogs, wolves, coyotes, and banana plants are related through common ancestry, that is the fairy tale. That is the theory of common descent, fish to fisherman evolution. I mentioned earlier that they believe that the ultimate source of genetic variation is mutations. Mutations over time, you can see here, these are the basics of evolutionary theory. Unfortunately for evolutionists, the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. They're disease-causing, they're damaging. They don't provide the necessary raw material to take your bacteria-like organism into a biologist over millions and billions of years. Here's an interesting paper, the human germline mutation rate. An average newborn contains 100 de novo mutations. And they admit right in the conventional literature that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. Apparently, this is one of the most well-established principles of evolutionary genetics, supported by both molecular and quantitative genetic data. What that means is mutations, which they look to as the source for genetic variation, actually put shelf lives on genomes. They limit the amount of change that can take place. And this is a major problem that they have to address. But to us as biblical creationists, the evidence fits beautifully. We've made several predictions based on the Bible passages we've read so far. We would expect low genetic diversity, which we're going to discuss, one Y chromosome ancestor, and one mitochondrial DNA ancestor. These creationist expectations has been confirmed. Let's go over some basic genetics in order that we can all be on the same page in terms of what we're discussing. A genome is all of your DNA. It is essentially the complete set of genetic instructions that a biological organism uses to develop and to function. Here on this visual, you can see that chromosomes come in pairs. You get one chromosome from mom, one chromosome from dad, which is why you've got one chromosome 1 and another chromosome 1, and so on and so forth. You've got your sex chromosomes, XY. If you have the Y chromosome, you're a man. XX, you'd be a woman. Now, this is all inside the nucleus. The nucleus of the cell contains all of the cell's chromosomes. These encode the genetic material of an organism. And as I said, you got two sets of chromosomes inside your nucleus, and each cell contains 23 pairs of chromosomes, totaling 46. God is an amazing engineer. A human cell contains 6 feet of DNA if all the DNA molecules were stretched out end to end. This is all packaged amazingly and organized into chromosomes that fit nicely into the tiny cell nucleus. There are several pieces of evidence that show exactly why origin of life is false. It doesn't work. They have no good explanation for how DNA could have originated. And one concept that I like to discuss, it's an easy to understand concept. This is the concept of mutually interdependent systems. Now, there's several examples we could discuss on this. One really good one that I could cover briefly has to do with DNA and DNA repair enzymes. Now, it is said that you can experience up to a million DNA breaks. Think about this, a million DNA breaks in a single cell in a single day. Now, we have 60 to 65 trillion cells in our bodies. Those are a lot of mistakes that are occurring on a daily basis. Thankfully, we have these amazingly designed DNA repair enzymes. They go in and they fix a lot of these DNA breaks. Thank God. Unfortunately, many do get passed on through germ cell line, which is a problem for evolution, but many are fixed. If they weren't, we'd go extinct in just a few generations. This is a major chicken and egg problem, though, for the naturalists, for the evolutionists, and I'll tell you why. It turns out that the information for these DNA repair enzymes are encoded in the DNA itself. So what came first, evolutionist? DNA, but you require DNA repair enzymes for the DNA to exist and to flourish. Or did the DNA repair enzymes come first? But wait a minute, evolutionists, you require the DNA to encode the information for the DNA repair enzymes. This means they both had to come into existence at the exact same time, fully functional, ready to go. And this is what the Bible describes in Genesis. Everything was created complete and everything was very good. Okay, our first major piece of evidence we are going to discuss, showing exactly why our first parents, Adam and Eve, are real, is low genetic diversity. Now, the creation and evolutionary models have two very different expectations on genetic diversity. The Bible's clear, as we've seen. God created two people, Adam and Eve, just roughly 6,000 years ago. What this would do is restrict levels of genetic diversity. You wouldn't have a whole lot of genes floating around a population of two. The evolutionary model, on the other hand, they would say we go back a couple 100,000 years to an out of Africa scenario. Prior to that, you go back millions of years to Australopithecine-like ancestors. You're probably familiar with Lucy, the famous Australopithecine. We are said to have evolved up through the Australopithecine lineage into Homo habilis and eventually Erectus, who lives on the globe for a couple million years before evolving independently outside of Africa, but also inside of Africa to humans. This means you're accumulating a lot of mutations over this amount of time. Mutations add something new, not necessarily good, but something new, because they're adding something that was not previously there. And so the evolutionary model would predict high levels of genetic diversity, while the biblical creation model would predict low genetic diversity. What have we discovered? Well, amazingly, this is right from the conventional literature. We've discussed that humans have very low genetic diversity. Notice this. Human genetic diversity is substantially lower than that of other species. Any two human beings are 99.99% identical. Any two people, me or someone in the auditorium, me and Matt, 99.99% the same, not different at all. All human beings are 99.9% identical in their genetic makeup. So we find in humans low diversity, but if deep time evolution were true, we should find higher levels of genetic diversity. The evolutionary model did not predict this. Evolutionary rescue devices don't work. What they invented was what's called the out of Africa population bottleneck. And so they say somewhere between 70 and 200,000 years ago, you have this near extinction event where the human population at that time, which was large, crashes into somewhere between 2 and 10,000, some say 30,000. And they say this in order to reduce the levels of genetic diversity. And so they have this extended bottleneck. This is all post hoc, ad hoc, after the fact, rather than tapping out and saying, okay, the Bible's true. The Bible's claims of origins have been validated. The problem is, and why this doesn't work, is because this would be an extended bottleneck, which would have comprised a lot of what's called inbreeding. Inbreeding is bad. It's harmful. It results in disease. Inbreeding, the best way to understand it, it reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes that have been accumulating for hundreds of thousands to millions of years. These mutations, these deleterious mutations, they come to the forefront and they result in rapid genetic decline or rapid genetic degeneration. And so that hypothetical population in the out of Africa theory would have been far too genetically compromised to have spread out into all parts of the globe and seized dominion over the planet, inventing vehicles and computers and the space shuttle. It's simply evolutionary philosophy. The real Eve, okay, mitochondrial DNA. Outside of the nucleus, we have the mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell. You've probably heard in biology class. These structures carry their own type of DNA, mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from the mother's side. It is uniparentally inherited. This DNA controls the conversion of sugars into energy, and it creates ATP. In each cell, you have many little, and the number does vary, but you have many little mitochondria that produce energy for us to live, for us to breathe, and to function. The energy produced from ATP sustains life, essentially. And this is an important Bible verse. And the science, I think, is going to blow your mind that has confirmed this Bible verse. Genesis 9:19, after the flood bottleneck, 8 people. These are the 3 sons of Noah, that's Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And of them was the whole earth overspread. Right here is a phylogenetic tree. What we can do is take mitochondrial DNA in the world and compare them. From here, we can build a family tree that does a couple important things. Firstly, it points us right back to a single female ancestor, just as the Bible says. And as a matter of fact, there exist 3 major haplogroups, mitochondrial DNA haplogroups. You can see this here in the middle. You've got the 3 arrows. These are 3 major nodes. The lines, they represent DNA differences or mutations over time. And all mitochondrial DNA can be traced back to these 3 major nodes. Well, as the Bible says, we start off 6,000 years ago with 2 people, Adam and Eve. A couple thousand years later, we have a bottleneck where the earth restarts with Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their 3 wives, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their 3 wives. That would be Noah's daughters-in-law. And amazingly, we have in the mitochondrial DNA 3 major nodes, which could be representing the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. To the evolutionist, this is just one big coincidence. But to the biblical creationist, this is exactly what we would expect to find. You can read more about this from Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, who has a fascinating research project where he's tracing the history of the planet. It's lining up perfectly with what the Bible says of human origins. The Bible demanded a single woman that every human being descended from. The evolutionary model did not predict this. The evolutionary model could have went either way. There did not have to be a single woman, a single man. They just retrofitted the data to fit it in. And there's reasons why the retrofitting of it doesn't work. When we look at mitochondrial DNA worldwide, the family tree collapses incredibly into a single person, and this occurs rapidly. This is Eve. Now, we've also got the Y chromosome. It is nuclear DNA, but it's not autosomal. It's within the nucleus, but it's uniparentally inherited. So just like the mitochondrial DNA, it's only passed down on one side. It is a master control switch. It influences the expression levels of thousands of genes on all the other chromosomes from the time a boy is in the womb to puberty and into adulthood. Again, the Y chromosome is passed down on the father's side, where the mitochondrial DNA is passed down on the mother's side. The question is, how much diversity do we see in these 2 compartments? We know overall, we discussed earlier, humans are nearly identical genetically. But in the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome, there's also very low levels of diversity. There's not a whole lot there. And so the question is, how long would it take to accumulate the amount of mutations that we see in these DNA compartments? On average, in the mitochondrial DNA, you can see this through many papers in the conventional literature, the fact that there is low diversity. In the mitochondrial DNA, the average DNA differences between any 2 people is about 25 to 30. In the Y chromosome, it's a couple hundred, maybe a few hundred, but the Y chromosome is much larger. It's about 65 million DNA letters. The mitochondrial DNA is about 16,500. So it's a very, very, very small chromosome. But we've only got a few DNA differences that have accumulated in both DNA compartments with a fast mutation rate. You can see this right in the conventional literature. You can see that estimates of the observed mutation rate. The observed mutation rate is the rate as to which we can see mutations accumulate. You can see this between, let's say in the mitochondrial DNA, you can see this between mothers and their children. You can study families and you can look at grandparents, parents and their children, and you get a very fast mutation rate. In the mitochondrial DNA, it's somewhere between one mutation every 2 to 5 generations. In the Y chromosome, it's even faster. It's somewhere between 1 and 3 every single generation. And so what we're looking at here is biblical time. Notice this, right from the conventional literature in 2022. Estimates of the mutation rate with a non-phylogenetic approach. The phylogenetic approach is the method that evolutionists use where they assume deep time, assume the geologic column and the dates provided for the geologic column. It assumes common ancestry with apes, makes many false assumptions. But notice what they admit. These mutation rates, the observed mutation rates, the empirical method, are reported to be approximately tenfold. That's 10 times higher than evolutionary derived or phylogenetically derived rates. Here's another paper. This paper, the Parsons paper, in the paper, they document the fact that if you were to just take the observed mutation rate in light of DNA diversity in the mitochondrial DNA, Eve would have lived just 6,000 years ago. Of course, they can't have that. They got to put forth rescue devices and explanations that are not scientific because they can't just admit, well, this confirms the Bible. But this is truly amazing. Right here, excerpt from this paper. This is roughly 20-fold higher than estimates derived from phylogenetic analyses. And so much faster. And if you use the observed rate, you get an Eve that's just 6,000 years ago. Here's another phylogenetic tree. This was made through worldwide mitochondrial DNA sequences by Dr. Rob Carter. He's a young Earth creationist. And what you see here is this explosion, this starburst pattern right from the center. What this suggests is rapid and exponential population growth. And that's what we would expect right after the flood, where you have these 3 reproducing couples. They're producing kids, their kids are producing kids, so on and so forth, repopulating the planet. We see this representing one woman. Again, there's a few DNA differences on this tree. That's what these lines represent, is DNA differences. There is history here on this tree. I could talk about it for an hour. For sake of time, I just want to point out one important reality here. This is the HVR haplogroup. This is all mitochondrial DNA, most common in Europe. Now, what you'll notice is these branches, there's irregular patterns. Some branches are longer than others. What this means is some people are picking up more mutations in the same amount of time than their cousins. That means mutation rates are not constant, which is troublesome for the evolutionist that wants to assume humans and chimps go back to a common ancestor. They want to count the DNA differences that separate those two creatures, trace it back to a common ancestor using the molecular clock. It doesn't work. Mutation rates are not as constant as they need them to be. This is a Y chromosome phylogenetic tree derived again by Dr. Rob Carter, showing one man, low diver. If I were to draw a circle right in here and disregard the longest lines, you're only looking at maybe 200-300 differences, and only a couple hundred more if you bring in your longest lineages, some of these tribes in Africa. This is biblical time with a mutation rate of 1 to 3 per generation, low diversity. You're looking at biblical time. It's fascinating. Now, I'm so glad that we scheduled this presentation when we did, because this is a new paper that just came out in 2025, just a month or so ago. You in the audience, you've probably heard of this claim that humans and chimpanzees are 98 to 99% the same. Is that really the case? 2025, this is a sophisticated report of the genetics of the great apes. They do consider humans as a great ape, which is false clearly by this data. And they've determined that over 12%, and it's funny, This is kind of hidden in the supplementary material of this paper. So you go find it, and you discover that over 12% of the human and chimpanzee genomes represent a gap difference. That means there's these massive genomic regions between humans and chimpanzees that can't even be aligned. And so right off the bat, you're 85, maybe 86% similar. And another interesting point is even between similar regions of humans and chimpanzees, there's differences in the way those genes are regulated. So even in similar sequences, there's massive differences in regulation, expression, epigenetics, alternative splicing. And this is fascinating because the evolutionist has to explain how these massive differences came about in just roughly 6 million years. This is the Y chromosome. This is Y chromosome data between the great apes. And so this will be the last major point that I touch on before I hand it to Matt. Time flies by when you're having fun. There's a lot of evidence here, guys, but this is one of my favorites. This completely wrecks evolution. Evolutionists, they like to focus on a lot of what's called agnostic lines of evidence. This is the confirmation bias fallacy. This would be like me looking to the sky and saying, evolutionist, the sky is blue, therefore evolution's true. The evolutionist could say, how can that be the case? We can also explain why the sky is blue. Or the evolutionist might say the earth is round, therefore evolution is true. But I would say the creation model can also explain why the earth is round. There's a lot of overlap in this evidence. And so what we need to focus on is what's called discriminatory evidence. A piece of evidence that can discriminate between the models, a piece of evidence that says, hey, only this model can explain this data. When an evolutionist looks to homology, these shared structures in the biological world, and they say evolution's true, this is a piece of evidence for evolution, well, that's false, because this is an agnostic piece of evidence. Since creationists, we can also explain homology. Human engineers design in homologous patterns, and so why shouldn't God? This makes sense. We as creationists, we can point to, as we have tonight, lines of evidence that only the creation model can explain. These lines of evidence preclude evolutionary theory, make it impossible. Those are the lines of evidence we need to focus on. And here's one major argument that the evolutionary community really struggles with. These are Y chromosomes between humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans. You'll notice the human Y here is much different than your chimpanzee Y. It's half the size. There's pieces of DNA here that aren't even in the chimpanzee. For example, this over here, it's color-coded. This is heterochromatin. It's this repetitive kind of DNA. It's densely packed. The chimpanzee basically lost the entire heterochromatic arm. And so when you consider overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, this is incredible. This is why it's an amazing time to be a biblical creationist. The human Y is less than 30% the same as the chimpanzee Y. And when you bring in the gorilla Y, the human and gorilla Y are more similar to each other than the chimpanzee Y, which breaks their what's called a nested hierarchy. And they admit, right in the conventional literature, notice what they say here. Despite a recent divergence of these species, that's their assumption built into these papers, their Y chromosomes differ just a bit? No, enormously in size and gene content. They admit here, the chimpanzee Y is only half the size of the human Y, and the percentage of gene families shared by these two chromosomes that split about 6 million years ago, according to their model, is similar to that shared by, notice this, human and chicken autosomes that split, according to their model, 310 million years. And assessing that visual, our assessment is correct. They say the human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y than to the chimpanzee Y. It gets even worse for them. This is the latest data on the Y chromosome. This is the most sophisticated analysis of ape sex chromosomes, the X and the Y, that is available. And the problem got even worse. So this was published in 2024, and this is all visually easy for the most part to examine. You go down here, here's human, You can compare it to the chimpanzee. So you go up here to the chimpanzee, 26.2%. Let that sink in. That means the human Y and the chimpanzee Y, they are less than 30% the same. To the evolutionist, they believe humans and chimps are related. They believe chimpanzees are our closest cousin and can be traced back to a common ancestor about 6 million years ago. The problem is, how do they explain these massive differences? Gene loss, gene gain, large scale chromosomal rearrangements. The chimpanzee Y chromosome has twice as many large palindrome sequences. Those are types of sequences that are there in the Y chromosome that serve to protect important genes in male fertility as the human Y. Completely different. And how do they explain it? Well, maybe this, maybe that, consider this. These are all untested. These are stories. This is imagination. This is why I like to say evolutionists hope, dream, and imagine that they're related to chimpanzees and can be traced back to a single-celled like ancestor billions of years ago. This is not science. This is evolutionary philosophy, which is important because we need to understand that without lies, evolution dies. And Matt, my brother, is going to continue proving that slogan right there. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, I think I even invented that slogan. So yeah, as you can see, there's lots of evidence coming right out the gate. That was the technical version. I'll try to keep mine a little bit more crazy. As you can see, I'm here at the Tower of Babel, so I've got a lot of evidence to share with you guys. And we are going to jump over and good. It looks like I'm screen sharing, correct?
Yes, looks good, Matt.
Okay.
I can see it.
Okay, good. All right. Well, now, if we were to go straight into the Bible, we would notice that God created Adam and placed him into a garden and told him to eat the fruit of the trees. However, animals were given a little bit of a different criteria as they were be able to eat the plants and um, pretty much a totally different diet than human beings. And what would we expect to see if that was true? Well, we would go into the intestinal tract of humans and chimpanzees and compare them, and we'd be like, wow, look at that. Literally everything is the exact opposite in size as it should be. Why would that be? We can look inside of pigs, as you can see right here, and compare them to humans, and they expected that pigs and humans should be identical because we're both omnivores. But if Adam was created to be a frugivore and eat from the fruit of the trees, we would expect to find that evidence. Then we would expect him to find to change his diet later. So another good independent line of ancestry would be the appendix. We are told that this is a vestigial leftover remnant of evolution that lost its primary function. But yet when we look inside of chimpanzees and compare them to humans, we find that they both have functions that are totally opposite of one another. Then we can jump into actual studies and we'll notice something. They were comparing the overall human being to other animals, the mucosa, the stomach lining, everything, they noticed that humans lined up in the frugivore category, not the omnivore, not the faunivore, which would be the plant eating, and not the carnivore. And so they have made an entire list where you can see we line up with a frugivorous monkey. Very interesting, right? Then they did studies on our teeth and found out that the teeth match frugivorous creatures. Of course, this is an evolutionary assumption that we evolved from these ancestors that ate fruit, but it still places us in the human category of frugivores. We can see right here, humans were raw and mucus-free fruitarians before they were vegetable eaters. Very interesting. Did you know Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, classified humans as frugivores, not omnivores? Here's a naturopath that said every anatomical, physiological, embryological feature of man definitively places him in the class of frugivore. The largest study ever done on health took massive amounts of people over 15 years and fed them fruit, different amounts. Some people ate 1 serving a day, the others ate 2 servings a day, the others 3, and so on. They noticed that the more fruit humans ate, the healthier they got, and the more disease went down. It was only cooking that allowed us to eat the foods outside of that. We can eat a salad, right? But it doesn't digest so well. Lots of cellulose. We can eat some carbohydrates and things, but they all require cooking. They even think that our desire to drink alcohol came from our desire and craving from the fruit, the sugars in fruit. Then when we look over and we go, well, some people actually like cilantro, for example, or coriander. But did you know that there was a single mutation on chromosome 11 that allowed us to like that flavor? That's why most people taste bitterness in soap and hate the flavor. And on chromosome 7, there's a bitter sensitivity taste on our tongue that also was a single point mutation that wasn't there that allowed us to like bitterness so we could start eating these other food groups. Otherwise, we wouldn't even touch them. We don't even like them. That's why people do. That's why even kids don't like their vegetables. There's a reason for that. So, what changed? Well, remember, God told Adam, now after the fall, because he sinned, they would now have to work by the sweat of their brow, and they would have to work for their food, meaning man would now be a forced omnivore by necessity. If this was true, we should find evidence that early man started eating that way. And we'll look at some of the evolutionary supposed ancestors that really are just human beings, by the way. Homo erectus was indeed an omnivore. We can see that. Heidelbergensis, another ancestor, yes, an omnivore. When we studied the teeth are very what they call wimpy teeth. The size and the shapes of incisors in primates are very strong, and in humans they're not. And they said, well, why are our teeth smaller? They said the diet is made it smaller because we started cooking our foods and changing. And this is the person that figured it out. Winston Price. He actually traveled to indigenous tribes and noticed that the teeth got worse when we started to industrialize our food and add sugar and everything. Here's another interesting things. If we notice down here at the bottom, we take wolves, a natural carnivore, and when we changed their diet to an omnivore, they increased in what's known as an AMY gene amylase. They got gene duplication so that they produce more saliva to help them digest carbohydrates. We noticed the same thing in humans. Humans would have been frugivore, and now we produce massive amounts of the amylase, which the other primates do not do. And then we notice that certain people have less of them than other people. That's why you can gain more weight. Some people can eat bread and stay thin. Others can eat it and they gain tons of weight. It just depends on how much amylase in the saliva is actually produced to help break down those carbohydrates. And over time, humans have been increasing the amount that we have in our system because we've changed our diet. Well, how about lifespan? Did man almost live for 1,000 years? Because the Bible shows the genealogies and it shows their ages that they live for a really long time. A lot of people say, no, there's no evidence that humans could ever live that long. Well, there actually is. Your genes, as well as the mutations in those genes, are responsible for how long you're going to live. This is Dr. Aubrey de Grey. He is a biomedical gerontologist that works for the Sense Foundation. And he says that with gene modification, when we go in and remove those mutations from inside of people, we have the maximum potential to live for about 1,000 years. And he's not the only one that says this. Here's Dr. David Goldhill, wrote an entire book on it. Here's a quote from Dr. Vaultier that said, with just a small modification of the genome, you can go from 2 years to 100 years. That's massive. Here's a professor of molecular biology that says the exact same thing. This guy is Ray Kurzweil. He's really famous because he takes $100 worth of supplements every single day to expand his life. But he's also a world-renowned scientist that says, no, we're really close to being able to live for 1,000 years. And be careful what you wish for if you want to live for 1,000 years. The possibilities are just around the corner. And here he is, Dr. Aubrey de Grey. Can aging be defeated, and can humans live for 1,000 years? Well, how can they do this? Well, one of the things that they're trying to right now, it's not there yet, is a gene editing system called CRISPR, where they can cut out mutations and replace the original sequence so that they can live longer. And we've now actually done this with animals. Flies and mice both have been done. They call it the Methuselah gene. They found a gene that makes you live longer, and they activated it, and they live 22% longer. That's just a single gene. They did the same thing in mice. They live 23% longer. So how are we going to do that? Well, that's the amazing part. Isn't if we go backwards in time to what's known as a consensus sequence, it's the original sequence that Eve had. We now know that she had the perfect genome. So isn't that ironic that if you remove mutations to go back to Eve's sequence, that we just happen to land on the perfect lifespan that the biblical ancestors lived to? Why not 2,000? Why not 400? It happens to land exactly on that. So now that we have Eve's consensus sequence, we can literally create little genetically altered babies to have Eve's sequence so that they don't have to do anything at all to live that long. Meaning you don't have to have a special diet, you don't have to take special supplements. Your genetic potential will just allow you to do it. How amazing is that? And there are species that scientists have noticed that don't increase in age. It's very confusing. A matter of fact, this is a paradox in evolution theory called the aging paradox. So that's what I was getting to earlier is, isn't it interesting that the maximum lifespan estimated by scientists perfectly lands on the biblical um, uh, uh, lifespan of humans in the past? Dawkins is notorious for this one. We don't need evidence for evolution. We just know it's true. I just think those quotes are so crazy. And when we go backwards in time, we actually notice that cultures from around the world talk about something called the Golden Age. The Persians, the India, over in Greece, in China, in Korea, the Sumerian kings list, even though they used a mathematical system of a base 60, which increased their age to hundreds of thousands, it still doesn't matter because all of these cultures have the exact same scenario. People living for about 1,000 years. Now, if you were writing a historical document and a religion you wanted people to believe, would you really start out with, "Yep, Grandpa, great great grandpa lived for 1,000 years"? You'd be like, "What are you talking about? It's so ridiculous. No one's going to believe this at all." So then come the creationist predictions. This is when we can go right to ICR. This was a really good one because he suggested that greater longevity and larger body size and delayed maturation. That's the waiting till you hit puberty. If that takes longer, you are going to live longer. And guess what? If you ask AI, is slower maturation usually associated with longer lives? Yes, it is. Do we have evidence for that? That's right, we do. In Neanderthal, in Heidelbergensis, in modern humans, it's always the same. We do. The ancestors had longer. So people in the past, our supposed ancestors that were supposedly only living 25 to 30 years, actually had evidence that they lived much longer. Here's a Neanderthal skeleton that are generally more robust, so they have the thickness of their bones. Another prediction that he made, Heidelbergensis, yes, thicker and more robust bones. Homo erectus, much thicker than modern human beings. These were early people right off the ark, and they lived longer. Here's one of the published studies, and in the very, very bottom in the fine print, you can see that they were 30% larger than modern humans today. So isn't that fascinating? You've got all these people. Look at them to the left of the modern day human, and that's on the far right. Thicker bone structure down the line, notorious for longer lifespan. Here's a jawbone of one of the ancient ancestors of Heidelbergensis. Massive. She could put her whole head in the thing. And if you want links to read those types of predictions and the evidence that they found, like when they look inside of bones, you know how when you cut a tree down, there's tree rings. They're noticing that bones have the same thing, and you can start counting the rings on how long something lived. And our ancestors had more of those rings than we do today. So just amazing, amazing evidence. Crazy. Then we can get into the genealogies. Are there evidence for genealogies outside of the Bible to prove that the scriptures are true? Absolutely. Here's one from the Lambeth Palace Library in 1711, and it is the list of British kings going all the way back and tracing their ancestors all the way to a son of Noah, and then pass back all the way to Adam and Eve. Matter of fact, the parchment itself is 52 feet long, tracking all of them. And then that list continues on today and goes all the way to Queen Elizabeth II. So that historical list goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. And then if you were to be like, okay, well, what about Africa? That's the origin of humans. What happens if we go to genealogies in Africa? Well, actually, It's the oldest documented historical dynasty, goes back to Ethiopia, to the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. So it goes back to the biblical scenario yet again. Their genealogies go into the biblical timeline. They don't have their own genealogies going back hundreds of thousands of years or anything like that. And this is an actual paradox in evolution theory. It's called the genealogical paradox. And based on population growth rates and everything like that, which if we look at population growth rate in itself, it falls on the biblical timeline again. Shocker, I know. I mean, what were people doing in Africa for 200 to 300,000 years? Clearly, they weren't having any population growth, which requires a net zero population growth rate going sideways, which is completely irrational. I mean, they have to invoke a bottleneck every 30 years for it to work. And even then, it still doesn't. So then we look at mutations that just randomly appear out of nowhere that are extremely detrimental. And they look at that. All of evolutionary history, there's none. And then right at around a little less than 5,000 years ago, they shoot up out of nowhere. I wonder what that could have been. Could it have been the flood? I think so. So, did God teach Adam language? And how would we ever know if he did? Well, the origin of language in the human species has been a topic of scholarly discussion for several centuries. In spite of this, there is no consensus for the ultimate origin of human language. There's different theories, though. The bow wow theory is where they copy dogs. Ooh, a bow wow. So that's the most popular, which is the kind of ridiculous. There's an emotional copying, and humans copied echoes of sounds and objects, or they grunted language in the existence, and they're just speculating all the different types. However, then comes along linguistic masters, and Walden here, he actually predicted there's something called a language acquisition layer. And what happens is that if kids don't learn language before puberty, they can never learn it. This was just a hypothesis. But then Eric Lindbergh, the guy on the right, he came along and he actually tested that with feral children, children that were left outside and not raised by humans, or children that were neglected, like Jeannie Wiley. She was locked in a room and neglected. And never talked to really. They would say words to her, of course, but they weren't trying to teach her language. And after she hit puberty, it was impossible to teach her language. So how could kids under the age of 12 evolve language? You can't. You have a very short window. After that, it can never be learned. So evolutionary theory now has to invoke that only 12-year-old and under could have made language. Or is it more reasonable to think that God taught Adam language and he passed it on? I mean, think about the first writing systems. They're the most advanced even today. We've repeated and copied their knowledge. We didn't invent new languages. And then we have rosehip neurons that only exist in the brain of human beings. Isn't that interesting? Helping us talk. So language can only be learned. I just went over that. So we have Adam teaching, Jesus teaching Adam how to speak and language. And that would make more sense than anything based on what we're going to get into next. Let's get into the oldest writing system. Chinese would be the oldest continuous writing system in the world today. So our writing system has changed dramatically. Look at this. We're down here, the modern alphabet. Then we go back to Rome, ancient Latin, and then we go to the ancient Greek, and then Phoenician, and then Paleo-Hebrew. That's how much ours has changed. And the oldest still has that mathematical system built into it. Fascinating. But let's look at the Chinese word to create. It says speak dust, life walking of mud. Sounds like Adam being created from the dust, doesn't it? How about garden? It means dust, breathe, two, enclosure, garden, persons. I'm sorry, two persons, enclosure, garden. The Garden of Eden, written right in their alphabet. Look at this. Temper, man, secret man, garden, alive, devil. Devil, trees, cover, temper. Oh my gosh, it's everywhere. We can see it. Isn't that fascinating? So again, what do we have the evidence for? The Bible says that at Babel, God confused and divided the languages into many different language groups or families. Evolution says that man slowly evolved language over time, starting in Africa from a single root origin. Let's see what the truth is. Here we go. Right out the gate, they found that there are 95 to 100 language families. They don't go back to a single root and they all come from one region of the world and branch out exactly where the Bible describes and predicted exactly where that should be. And look at that. Isn't that interesting that it also matches the haplogroups? What a haplogroup is it's a mutation that arises in a population and reaches fixation. So all of the people of that group have it. And look at that. It falls into place exactly where the mutation rates take off, where language arises. I mean, you can't get better than that. This is amazing. How about pyramids? Pyramids all seem to arise there and then branch out from that region. And guess what? They all use the same math. How interesting is that? They use the meter to make every pyramid in the world. So you would think, how would that be possible? Well, if everybody was in the same area and then their language was confused and they couldn't talk to each other anymore, they would take their same math and they would disperse and cover the world and they would create pyramids or whatever based on the same math system that they knew to create the Tower of Babel with. It's exactly what we see. So, did we find any original language coming out of Africa being documented, written down, and then evolving over time into all the other language families? We do not. It's completely falsified. And it's backed up by the fact that we have flood myths and traditions all around the world, everywhere. So, why? Probably because it's true and there's some historical value to it. So, you know, I think it's solved when we use the most basic logic of all. And then what else can we do? We can say, well, why would the pyramids be everywhere with the same size? Again, a single origin source. And then how about agriculture? It all branches out again from the Middle East. Why not Africa? They've been living there almost 200,000 years. And then they waited till the last few thousand to just all invent it in the same area and then branch out from there. Look at that. Right in the Fertile Crescent. That's where they say agriculture started. What a shocker. Oh, not in Africa? It didn't start in Africa and get better over time? It never did. It did not. And it matches those haplogroups I was talking about earlier that branch right out of there. Exactly what we would expect. Why not in Africa? Look at how few there are in Africa. Why? They're in small tribes all over the entire continent. You know how big Africa is? You could fit the whole United States, Canada. You could fit all of China in there. It's huge. It's huge. So no one can say, "Oh, they didn't have enough time or anything." It's just, they had more than enough time. They had more than enough people. They had tribes everywhere, and they couldn't do what we did in the Middle East easily. So the evidence fits this. It does not fit the evolutionary story that they've been feeding you at all. And how are we on time? Because I can just keep going, or we probably should get to Q&A. Could you?
Other species is as similar as humans in genetic makeup.
Oh, yeah, they used to think that the aardvark was the most common ancestor to humans. Then they've changed it a few times actually. Yeah. There's now it's the chimpanzee is the highest, but there were times when it was not. And it's there are a lot the pig is 96% related to humans and dogs are 95. So extremely high genetic similarity.
I
Extreme.
think I think if the questioner, Ross, was wondering, are the genetics that we're discussing in humans of low diversity, is that similar in animals as well, lining up with the creation model? I'm not sure if that's what he was getting at, but I could add a couple things. And Matt, you've done a lot of study on the genetic boundaries research that took place recently, where they discovered low diversity in the biological world, and it was in a highly conserved mitochondrial DNA protein called the CO1 gene. And they concluded, these are secular scientists, they concluded that all species originated at the exact same time, which would line up with exactly what we're talking about with humans, where you have God creating two humans, Adam and Eve, just thousands of years ago. The genetics confirm that. And then the flood bottleneck, where you have all animals reduced to two of every kind, seven or 14 of some, if depending on how you interpret that. And now the genetic data lines up with that as well.
I think a question that some might think of, talking about the problems when close relatives marry. Of course, Adam and Eve's children had to marry siblings. Just make a comment on that.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things, and then Matt, feel free to respond as well. This is a common objection, Ross. This is a great question, an excellent question. I've done, and so has Matt. We've done several debates over the years. We actually have one coming up in about a week with prominent evolutionists, and they almost always bring up that objection. Well, you have Adam and Eve, which are just two people, and so they'd have to have kids, and their kids would have to marry close relatives, and the same thing would apply to the flood bottleneck with Noah's family. And so they would, this would be inbreeding. So how did they not go extinct? Well, there's a couple important issues here, a couple ways to answer this. At creation, if you remember in my presentation, I talked about how Adam and Eve would have been created with design diversity. They'd be front loaded with pre-existing functional, beneficial DNA differences. They'd be free from mutations. So Adam and Eve would have no mutations. Inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. So these genetic mutations come about through close intermarriage and result in genetic disease. Adam and Eve would have had no mutations. And so there'd be no inbreeding problem. And it's pretty clear biblically that there would have been rapid and exponential population growth. So even though you have a bottleneck at creation, Ross, it'd be one generation followed up by rapid and exponential population growth. And so really no negative effects. And then at the flood, there'd probably be very little mutations accumulated over those couple thousand years because you'd have more of a pristine environment, more DNA repair enzymes. So after the flood, that was also one generation followed up by rapid and exponential population growth. So the effects of inbreeding would have probably been minimal. They would have been there a little bit after the flood because some mutations would have accumulated since creation, but it would have been minimal. But with the evolutionary model, here's the last thing I'll say, Matt, feel free to add whatever you'd like to. The evolutionary model, as I was explaining in my presentation, Ross, they have an extended bottleneck, which is why their out of Africa story, it's unrealistic. It's not feasible because they're the ones that would have a severe inbreeding problem.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, if you guys can see my screen, I'm going to show you that it was in Leviticus where the law finally came up. But we also have examples in the animal kingdom. Because remember, there was a global flood bottleneck, which would also have reduced all the animals to inbreeding. So do we find that that's a problem? We actually don't. And we know this from real world observations where animals are dropped off on islands and left. And why they're dropped off, probably for whatever reason. There could be multiple, but here's a single pair of sheep that happened to. There's a stick insect called the three types of lobsters, but they're actually insects. They had no problem regrowing. There's finches founded by a single pair. They had no problem. There's 24 rabbits that were dropped off in Australia. There are 200 million of them today. Here were 5 deer, 1 male and 4 female. They now are the highest species in Finland. You can hunt them all you want because there's so many. There were 14 bison, left on Catalina Island for a movie film, and then they just left them. They grew to 600, no problem, no inbreeding issues whatsoever. And then we have the mouflon sheep that were left on a single island as well. And look, unexpected heterozygosity increase, meaning they didn't expect this. Evolution would never have expected inbreeding animals to go up in genetic diversity, but that's exactly what happens until they fill up a niche. So remember, God's command for people was it be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. If you don't do those things, then you're going to get problems from inbreeding. Mankind was supposed to do it. They didn't do it. That's why God confused their language. He knew you're going to inbreed yourself into non-existence. I need to stop this. God knew, we didn't know. We didn't know anything about genetics back then. So I find that very fascinating that we can look to animals and we find no problem whatsoever.
Question? Go ahead.
Yeah, where do these mutations come from?
Great
That's a
question.
good, yeah, that's a good question, Matt. I'll give a couple thoughts and then you can answer as well. So mutations definitionally are alterations in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. So you got ATCG, and so it would be an alteration of one of those DNA letters, but it's analogous to a spelling mistake. So a typographical error in a book, that's basically a mutation. And there's this problem of genetic entropy. And we've discussed this. I know Ross has as well. It's a major problem to evolutionists because it's the fact that mutations accumulate. Most of them are deleterious. The mutation rate, so you're getting roughly 100 to 200 typographical errors. So these spelling mistakes every single generation. It happens because, as I was explaining in the presentation, the DNA repair enzymes don't work perfectly. And so there's errors that accumulate. And for the evolutionists, that's a problem because most of those are unselectable. Selection can't see them. And so they accumulate, they spread, they degenerate. And last thing I'll say, because this is an important issue, now that we know that the vast majority of the genome is functional rather than junk, that means these deleterious mutations erode genetic functionality even more. Evolutionists, they require genomes of junk in order that the high mutation rate, when those mutations hit, according to them, junk regions, they become neutral. But now that we know the vast majority of the genome is functional, they're not neutral. They're nearly neutral. They're slightly deleterious. It's very similar to rust on a car. You can't see each rust molecule. It's inconsequential to the car, but over time, the rust builds up and destroys the car. And so mutations are a huge, huge problem for evolution. Matt, any thoughts, brother?
Yeah, there's two types of mutations. Most people are familiar with the mutations that kind of age the person real rapidly. We know this from twins, where one is a smoker and a drinker, and the other one is an exercise or a fitness person. And the one that smokes and drinks a lot, it gets more mutations, and they age themselves rapidly, but they don't pass those mutations on. So some of the most dangerous mutations would, for the person, would be those. They're called somatic mutations. Other mutations are what we're talking about that go all the way back to Adam and Eve, because once they were removed from the tree of life, there was something about the fruit that probably kept them mutation free. And when they were removed from that, aging, the deleterious effects started happening. And we know from this study right here from 2012 that mutations are passed on mostly from the father to the offspring, and it's based on age. So the older a father gets when they have kids, the more mutations the kids will inherit. That's why Noah, when he was 500, passed on the most amount of mutations ever, and why his kids only lived to 400 to 500 and below. That's why the age system dropped off dramatically, because obviously people today mostly having kids between 20 and 40. You're not passing on that many. And again, in the Bible, we read that they were having children much younger than 500, and that really high age really decreased the human lifespan to where it's at today.
Yeah, I'll add this too, because I think that's an important point. That is the concept of patriarchal drive. Dr. Rob Carter does a really good job explaining it, where Shem, Ham, and Japheth could have been genetic poison to the human population post flood. Because if you're having kids if you're hundreds of years old and you're having kids, well, that means a man is accumulating more mutations, and now more mutations are being flooded into the next generation. And so on a phylogenetic tree, you could have a long branch. Matt, does this make sense? You'd have a long branch where the evolutionists would say, oh, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of mutations accruing over time, where actually, no, it could be a single generation because that individual lived to 400 or 500, had a kid, and passed on a lot of mutations.
So if it's just the genes why you live longer, why during just after the flood the age drop off significantly? Is it because of the narrowing of everybody that there's just less genetic information or environment?
Matt, you want to take this, brother?
Sure. There's different actually guesses on that. Kent Hovind believes in the firmament that surrounded the Earth and that it was allowed more oxygen and pressure going on, and animals lived a lot longer in the past as well. So. That would make a lot of good sense because it also affected animals and not just humans. As where when we want to explain it from a human perspective, we're going with the John Sanford, who was and Robert Carter, who noticed that if Noah was 500, he would have passed on lots of deleterious mutations that his sons inherited. So they cut the lifespan of them in half. Then they handed down lots of mutations, and that cut them in half again. And then eventually it plateaus around 100 and 120, and then it just moves sideways after about 20 generations. That's why Jacob, I think, mentions that he was 147 years old, and he was living at the time of Pharaoh. So by then, about 20 generations later, the lifespan was really starting to flatten out and plateau. So yeah, there's multiple theories.
Well, another major issue too is this that people sometimes forget to consider is the flood being a catastrophic worldwide event would have comprised a lot of heat, energy, and radiation. And so you'd have what's called radiation rocks after the flood. And so that shift, that negative shift in environment would have also caused lifespans to rapidly drop. And that's a major reason why you see Neanderthals and other hominin, so-called hominins, that's how evolutionists view them. We've sequenced their DNA and we've discovered that they have a lot of mutations. They have a lot more mutations than we do. But in light of where they lived after the flood, a lot of them lived in caves. They'd be subject to a lot of that leftover radiation from the flood. And we know today from studies, I have at least one or two studies that show that kind of radiation and chemical damage could vastly speed up the mutation rate. So a group like Neanderthals, it's not that they're older. That's what evolutionists want to argue, is that they've accumulated more mutations, but in a short amount of time. And so I think it's the massive shifts in environment and also in genetics that resulted in the decreased lifespan.
Okay, I'm going to take a break here. I think you guys are willing to stay online for some private questions. Is that true? Does your schedule allow that?
Yeah, yep, I'll be here.
Yeah, I want to make one comment about the genetic response to increased radiation. Creation Research Society did a project they called the RATE project, looking at rates of radioactive decay, and concluded there are a lot of the decay products of the uranium and thorium series, but there's not very much helium in the rocks, which could be what happens to alpha decay. An alpha particle would pick up electrons and would turn into helium. But helium is a very slippery gas, and yet there's more helium than could be expected if that radioactive decay took place over a long period of time. So that the indication is that there was a burst of radiation around the time of the flood, and then you see the geometric decay of the span of life going down after that. Well, I want to thank our speakers for this wonderful presentation. Folks, come back next month. We have Dr. Joseph Cazell talking about God's amazing creatures. In August, we have Kids Night, a program. It's especially geared for kids. I think some of our most interesting programs have been Brian Young. He had a device that would shoot a ping pong ball through a pop can. Now, I don't know if he's going to do that. You know, you've heard people using helium to make their voice high, but he had a gas that if you inhaled it, it gave you a Darth Vader voice. Now that's coming in August. And Brian Lauer is going to talk about the errors in textbooks in September, just in time for school. So keep coming back. If you would like to give and you need to do it online, go to our website, tccsa.tc, and there are links that allow you to give online. So thank you.
Thank you very much. This was awesome. I had a lot of fun.